The winter of 1880 came to Wyoming territory with a silence that felt like burial. Snow fell in the kind of stillness that makes men forget the sound of their own voices, that makes the wind itself seem like an intruder when it finally arrives. In the months following the violent summer, when the last of the Shoshone had been driven from their ancestral hunting grounds near the Wind River Range, the white settlers who remained found themselves inheriting something more than land. They inherited a quiet that was not peace. They inherited a cold that was not merely winter. They inherited nights that stretched long and sleepless, filled with sounds that had no source and fears that had no name. The cabin stood 3 miles north of what would become the town of Lander, though in 1880 it was nothing more than a trading post and a cluster of tents where prospectors and cattlemen gathered to drink and lie about their fortunes. The structure itself was unremarkable in almost every way. Built from lodgepole pine and chinked with mud and moss, it sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense stands of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. A creek ran nearby, cold and clear, fed by snowmelt from the mountains that rose like broken teeth against the western sky. The cabin had been built 3 years earlier by a trapper named Samuel Goode, a man who had come west from Pennsylvania with dreams of wealth and solitude. He found the latter in abundance. The former eluded him until the day he died. Samuel Goode was not the first to die in that place, though the records would not show this truth for many years. The land on which he built his cabin had been, for generations beyond counting, a place the Shoshone avoided. They called it Nami Hupia, which in their tongue meant something close to ghost ground, or place where the dead walk upside down. The translation was never precise because the concept itself did not translate well into the language of the settlers. How do you explain to men who believe the earth is a resource to be claimed that some places are not meant for the living? How do you tell them that certain grounds hold memories so deep and so dark that they seep upward like water through floorboards, that they manifest in the small hours before dawn when a man's defenses are lowest and his mind most vulnerable to suggestion? Samuel Goode did not believe in curses. He believed in iron traps and good aim and the 50 cents a pelt that beaver fur would bring him in Cheyenne. He built his cabin with his own hands over the course of one summer, working from dawn until the light failed, driven by the kind of stubborn independence that characterized so many who came west in those years. He notched the logs with precision, fitted them together with care, constructed a stone fireplace that drew smoke cleanly and kept the interior warm even when the temperature dropped below zero. He built a loft accessible by a ladder where he stored his furs and supplies. He hung his traps from pegs on the wall. He arranged his meager possessions with the attention of a man who intended to stay. The first winter passed without incident. Samuel trapped the creeks and streams, collected his pelts, and spent his evenings by firelight reading from the single book he owned, a leather-bound Bible his mother had given him before he left Pennsylvania. He was not a religious man in the conventional sense, but he found comfort in the familiar words, in the cadence of the verses, in the illusion of company they provided during the long months of isolation. When spring came, he traveled to Cheyenne to sell his furs, then returned to his cabin to prepare for another season. He seemed content. He seemed, by all accounts, to be thriving in the wilderness he had claimed as his own. The second winter was different. In a letter to his brother dated November of 1878, Samuel mentioned difficulty sleeping. He wrote that the cabin seemed to settle strangely in the cold, that the logs contracted and groaned in ways that kept him awake. He attributed this to the season, to the severity of the temperature, to the natural behavior of wood in extreme conditions. But in a second letter, written just after Christmas, his tone had changed. He wrote of sounds he could not explain. Footsteps, he said, that seemed to walk across the ceiling of his cabin in the hours between midnight and dawn. Not the scurrying of rodents or the scratch of branches against the roof, but deliberate, measured footsteps, as if someone were walking slowly back and forth in the loft above his head. Samuel climbed into the loft repeatedly during those weeks, searching for evidence of an intruder or an animal that might have found its way inside. He found nothing. The space was empty except for his furs and supplies, exactly as he had left them. No tracks in the dust, no droppings, no sign that anything living had disturbed the stillness of that elevated space. Yet the sounds continued. Every night, sometimes for hours at a time, the footsteps walked. They crossed from one end of the loft to the other, then back again, a steady rhythm that Samuel began to anticipate with dread as the sun set each evening. By February of 1879, Samuel Goode had stopped writing letters. When a supply trader named Dutch Henry stopped at the cabin in early April, he found Samuel sitting outside in the mud and melting snow, his rifle across his knees, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Dutch Henry later told others that Samuel looked like a man who had not slept in weeks, that his hands shook when he tried to light his pipe, that he spoke in fragments and half-sentences that made little sense. When Dutch Henry asked if he was sick, Samuel laughed, a sound that Dutch Henry described as cracked and wrong. He said he was not sick. He said the cabin was sick. He said the ceiling was sick. Then he went inside and closed the door, and Dutch Henry, unnerved by the encounter, rode away and did not look back. 3 weeks later, a pair of prospectors traveling north from South Pass City found Samuel Goode hanging from one of the rafters in his loft. He had used a length of rope he normally employed for hauling pelts. His body had been there for several days, swaying slightly in the drafts that moved through gaps in the walls. The prospectors cut him down and buried him in a shallow grave behind the cabin, marking the spot with a crude cross made from 2 pieces of split pine. They took what they could carry from inside the cabin, his traps and rifle and the few coins he had hidden in a tobacco tin, then continued on their way. Neither man ever spoke of what they heard while they were inside that structure. Neither man ever returned to that clearing. The cabin stood empty through the summer and into the fall. In late October of 1879, a family named Pruitt arrived in the area, traveling west from Nebraska with 2 wagons, 3 children, and the kind of desperate optimism that drove people toward uncertain futures. William Pruitt was a farmer by trade, though the drought had destroyed his crops 3 years running, and he had decided to try his fortune in the territories. His wife, Catherine, was a small, severe woman who read scripture aloud every morning and believed that hard work and faith could overcome any obstacle. Their children were aged 12, 9, and 6, 2 boys and a girl, thin and quiet from months of travel and inadequate food. When William Pruitt discovered the abandoned cabin in the clearing, he believed he had found a miracle. A ready-made shelter with a good fireplace and 4 solid walls, situated near water and timber, far enough from town to avoid trouble but close enough to trade if necessary. The crude grave behind the structure gave him pause, but only briefly. Men died in the wilderness all the time. Accident, illness, exposure, violence. It meant nothing except that the cabin was now available for those who needed it, and William Pruitt needed it desperately. His wife had been coughing blood for 2 weeks. His youngest child had developed a fever that would not break. Winter was coming fast, and they had nowhere else to go. The Pruitts moved into the cabin on the 1st of November, 1879. They cleaned the interior, swept out the accumulated debris and animal droppings, scrubbed the floors and walls with lye soap Catherine had made from ash and pig fat. They repaired gaps in the chinking, replaced several broken window panes with oiled paper, restocked the woodpile from the forest around them. William reinforced the ladder to the loft and moved most of their supplies up there to keep them dry and away from scavengers. Catherine hung muslin curtains, arranged their few possessions with care, tried to create something resembling a home in that rough space. The children, initially frightened by the isolation and strangeness of their new surroundings, gradually adjusted. They explored the creek, built small cairns from river stones, invented games that required nothing but imagination and the endless trees. For 2 weeks, the Pruitts lived in something approaching peace. William spent his days cutting firewood and hunting, managing to bring down a mule deer that would provide meat through much of the winter. Catherine's cough improved slightly in the dry cold. The youngest child's fever broke. They began to talk tentatively about spring, about planting a garden, about building an addition to the cabin if they decided to stay. They held evening prayers around the fireplace, the children's voices joining their parents in reciting verses that had been passed down through generations, words that were meant to provide comfort and protection against the uncertainties of life on the frontier. The footsteps began on the night of November 15th. Catherine woke first, her hand instinctively reaching for her husband in the darkness. "William, are you awake?" she whispered. He was not, but her voice pulled him from sleep, and in the silence that followed he heard it clearly. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the ceiling above their heads. Back and forth, back and forth. The steady rhythm of someone pacing in the loft where their supplies were stored, where no one should be walking because the children were asleep in their bedrolls near the fireplace and both adults were in their bed below. William lit a candle and climbed the ladder before Catherine could stop him. She heard him moving above her head, heard the creak of the floorboards under his weight, heard him searching through their stores. When he climbed back down, his face was pale in the candlelight. "Nothing," he said. "There is nothing up there." Catherine asked if he was certain, and he nodded, but his hand trembled as he set the candle on the table. They lay awake for the rest of the night, listening as the footsteps continued until the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the windows. Then, as suddenly as they had started, the sound stopped. The next night, the footsteps returned, and the night after that, and every night thereafter with a regularity that became its own kind of torture. The Pruitts tried everything they could think of to explain or stop the phenomenon. William searched the loft before bed each evening, sometimes spending an hour moving every crate and bundle, checking every corner, finding nothing. Catherine sprinkled salt across the floor of the loft, an old superstition she had learned from her grandmother, then swept it away in the morning when it made no difference. They prayed. They sang hymns. They tried sleeping in shifts so that one of them could keep watch while the other rested, but exhaustion overcame them both, and they would wake to find the footsteps walking above them in the darkness, patient and relentless as a heartbeat. The children began to change in ways that terrified Catherine more than the footsteps themselves. The eldest boy, Thomas, developed a nervous habit of looking up at the ceiling constantly, his eyes tracking invisible movement across the rough pine boards. He would stop mid-sentence during their meager lessons, his gaze drawn upward as if by magnetic force, and Catherine would have to call his name 3 or 4 times before he would look at her again. His face, when he finally tore his attention away from the ceiling, bore an expression of deep confusion, mixed with something that looked almost like recognition, as if he were beginning to understand something that should remain forever incomprehensible to a 12-year-old boy. Mary, the middle child, stopped speaking except in whispers, and only when directly questioned. She had been a chattering, curious girl during their journey west, full of questions about the landscape and the animals they saw, and the stories her mother told from the Bible. Now she moved through the cabin like a small ghost herself, her footsteps deliberately soft, as if she were trying to make herself as quiet as possible so as not to attract the attention of whatever walked above them. She developed a habit of covering her ears whenever the footsteps began, pressing her palms flat against the sides of her head, and closing her eyes tight, rocking back and forth in a rhythm that almost matched the cadence of the sound she was trying to block out. The youngest, James, woke screaming almost every night, though he could never explain what frightened him, or perhaps he simply had no words for the fear that had taken root inside him like a dark seed. His screams were not the ordinary cries of a child having nightmares. They were raw and primal, the sounds of someone experiencing terror beyond the reach of language, beyond the capacity of a 6-year-old mind to process or categorize. Sometimes he would wake already standing, his eyes open but unseeing, his small body rigid as he stared up at the ceiling and made sounds that were not quite words, syllables that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, guttural and strange and wrong. Catherine tried to maintain their routines, insisted on morning prayers and lessons from the Bible, but her voice had taken on a brittle quality, and her hands shook when she ladled out their evening meals. She found herself unable to complete certain verses that she had known by heart since childhood. The words would catch in her throat, or she would lose her place and have to start over, or she would reach a particular passage and find that she could not remember what came next, as if the cabin itself were somehow interfering with her memory, erasing the protective scriptures from her mind piece by piece. She began to repeat the same prayer over and over, the Lord's Prayer, because it was the one she could still remember in its entirety, speaking it aloud dozens of times each day, like a ward against the darkness that seemed to be closing in around them from all sides. William watched his family disintegrate and felt himself powerless to stop it. He was a man who had always believed that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle, that faith and strength were sufficient to protect those he loved. But this situation defied every principle he had built his life upon. He could not work his way out of it. He could not fight it. He could not pray it away. All he could do was witness the slow destruction of his wife's sanity and his children's innocence, and know that he had brought them to this place, had made the decision to stay in the cabin that was now consuming them from the inside out. William Pruitt was a practical man, and he refused to accept that there was no rational explanation for what they were experiencing. He had spent his life solving problems through logic and action, and he was determined to apply those same principles to this situation, even as every fiber of his being screamed that he was dealing with something beyond the reach of practical solutions. On the night of December 3rd, he decided to spend the entire night in the loft itself, armed with his rifle and a lantern, determined to confront whatever was causing the sounds. Catherine begged him not to go up there, clutching at his arm with hands that had grown thin and desperate, but he ignored her pleas and climbed the ladder as the sun set. He positioned himself in the center of the loft, his back against a stack of grain sacks, his rifle across his knees, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the circle of lamplight. He had checked every corner, moved every crate, examined every board for loose nails or gaps that might explain the sounds. Everything was solid. Everything was normal. The loft was just a loft, a storage space in an ordinary cabin, and he was going to prove that whatever they had been hearing had a rational cause, something they had simply overlooked in their exhaustion and fear. The family below fell into uneasy sleep, or something resembling it, while William kept his vigil above. He could hear Catherine's restless movements, the children's occasional whimpers and cries. He could hear the wind outside beginning to pick up, the first harbinger of the storm that was building in the mountains to the west. He could hear his own breathing, his own heartbeat, the creak of the wood beneath him as he shifted his weight. Normal sounds, natural sounds. Nothing more sinister than the ordinary noises of an old cabin settling in the cold. Midnight came and passed. The cabin was silent except for the pop and hiss of the fire below and the occasional settling of the logs. William felt his eyelids growing heavy despite his determination to stay alert. He pinched his thigh hard enough to leave bruises, bit the inside of his cheek until he tasted blood, forced himself to remain vigilant. He counted the boards in the ceiling above him, trying to keep his mind occupied. 23 boards running lengthwise, each one cut from lodgepole pine, each one fitted carefully into place by Samuel Goode 3 years earlier. Each one solid and real and perfectly ordinary. Then, precisely at midnight according to his pocket watch, the footsteps began. Not beneath him, where they would have come from the main floor of the cabin where his family slept. Not beside him, where they would have indicated someone else in the loft, some intruder who had somehow evaded his careful search. But above him, directly above him, on the other side of the ceiling, on the roof itself, or in some impossible space between the roof and the ceiling that should not exist, that could not exist, the footsteps walked. Slow, deliberate, measured. The weight of them was substantial, not the light scratch of a small animal, but the solid impact of something man-sized or larger, placing one foot in front of the other, with methodical precision, back and forth, the same pattern they had followed every night. But now William was beneath them, separated from them only by a few inches of wood, and he understood with a horror that turned his stomach to ice and made his bladder threaten to release that there was no rational explanation, that something was in this cabin that could not be fought with rifles or driven away with prayers, that they were sharing this space with something that existed in defiance of every natural law he had been taught to believe in. He raised the rifle and pointed it at the ceiling, his hands shaking so badly that the barrel wavered in the lamplight. He wanted to fire, to shoot through the boards and hit whatever was up there, but some instinct deeper than reason told him that bullets would do nothing, that the thing walking above him was not made of flesh and bone, was not vulnerable to lead or steel or any weapon a man could wield. He lowered the rifle slowly, the weight of it suddenly unbearable, and simply sat there listening as the footsteps continued their endless pattern, marking time, measuring space, claiming territory that had never been his to grant. The sounds went on for hours. William did not move except to check his watch periodically, marking the passage of time as if recording it could somehow make it less real, less overwhelming. 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. The footsteps never varied their rhythm, never paused, never acknowledged his presence below them. It was as if he did not exist, as if the loft and everything in it were irrelevant to whatever purpose drove that invisible walker in its endless circuit. He began to feel that he was the intruder here, that he and his family were the ghosts haunting someone else's space, that they were the ones who did not belong, and the cabin knew it, the land knew it. Something ancient and patient knew it, and was simply waiting for them to understand and leave. As dawn approached, William felt something shift in the air around him. The temperature, which had been merely cold, became frigid enough to make his breath visible in the lamplight. The shadows in the corners of the loft seemed to deepen and move, independent of the flickering flame, and the footsteps, which had maintained their pattern all night, suddenly stopped directly overhead, as if the walker had finally noticed him, as if it had finally decided to acknowledge the man who had dared to position himself beneath its nightly rounds. In the silence that followed, William could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the blood rushing in his ears, could hear Catherine stirring below, waking to the absence of the sounds that had become so familiar. He wanted to call down to her, to tell her he was all right, but his voice was frozen in his throat, locked there by a terror so profound it had physically paralyzed him. He sat and waited, knowing something was about to happen, feeling it in the air around him, in the way the lamplight suddenly seemed dimmer, in the way his own body felt heavy and strange, as if gravity had shifted subtly, as if the rules governing the physical world had begun to fray. Then he felt it. A presence, not visible, not audible, but unmistakably there, occupying the space above the ceiling, pressing down on the boards, testing them, weighing them, considering. William looked up and saw the wood begin to bow, just slightly, just enough to be visible in the lamplight, as if something impossibly heavy had lowered itself onto the other side. He watched as the boards creaked and groaned, as dust sifted down between the cracks, as the entire structure of the ceiling seemed to soften and become malleable, as if it were no longer wood but something liquid, something that could be penetrated, something that was about to give way and release whatever waited on the other side. William closed his eyes. He could not bear to see what was coming. He sat there in the darkness behind his eyelids and prayed, not the Lord's Prayer that Catherine had been repeating endlessly, but a prayer of his own invention, desperate and formless, a plea to whatever God or force governed the universe to spare him, to spare his family, to let them survive this night and see the morning. He prayed with an intensity he had never brought to worship before, and he felt the presence above him grow stronger in response, as if his fear were feeding it, as if his terror were exactly what it wanted, what it needed, what it had been waiting for all along. William climbed down from the loft at dawn. His face was gray as ash. He would not speak of what he had heard or felt during those hours, but Catherine said later that he seemed diminished somehow, as if something essential had been taken from him during the night. He began making preparations to leave immediately, insisting they would pack the wagons and depart within 2 days, that they would risk traveling in winter, rather than spend another week in that cabin. Catherine did not argue. She had seen the thing that had replaced the confidence in her husband's eyes. She had seen it, and she understood that they were in danger of something worse than cold or hunger, or any of the physical threats that the frontier could offer. But the winter had other plans. A storm moved in on the morning of December 5th, bringing snow so thick that visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. The wind howled through the trees with a voice that sounded almost human, almost mocking. The temperature plummeted. William knew that attempting to travel in such conditions would be suicide. They would have to wait out the storm, then leave as soon as the weather cleared. He reinforced the door with a heavy timber, as if that could protect them from what walked above their heads each night. He loaded his rifle and kept it close. He tried to project strength for his family, but his children could see the fear in his eyes, and it terrified them more than the sounds themselves. The footsteps grew worse during the storm. They no longer confined themselves to the hours after midnight. They began in the afternoon, continued through dinner, persisted until dawn, back and forth, back and forth. The rhythm never varied. It was as if something were measuring the space above them, marking boundaries that only it could see, claiming territory that had never been meant for human occupation. Catherine began to unravel. She sat by the fire and rocked back and forth, matching the rhythm of the footsteps, her lips moving in constant prayer that became less like worship and more like an incantation, words repeated until they lost all meaning. The children huddled together in one corner, their eyes wide and dark, their faces thin and pale in the firelight. On the 8th night of the storm, something changed. The footsteps stopped in the middle of their pattern, directly above the center of the cabin. They stopped, and in the silence that followed, William could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the breathing of his wife and children, could hear the storm outside and the fire crackling and nothing else. Nothing else except a single creak, as if a great weight had settled onto the floorboards of the loft. Then another creak, then another. Something was descending, not down the ladder, but through the ceiling itself, as if the wood were no more substantial than water, as if the barrier between the loft and the living space below had become permeable, had dissolved, had ceased to exist. William raised his rifle, pointing it at the ceiling where the sounds were coming from. His hands were steady, though his mind was screaming at him to run, to grab his family and break through the door and take his chances in the storm. But he was the father, the protector, and so he held his ground even as he watched the ceiling begin to bulge downward, the wood bowing as if under tremendous pressure, as if something impossibly heavy were pressing against it from above. Catherine gathered the children behind her, her arms spread wide in a futile gesture of protection. They watched as cracks began to appear in the pine boards, thin dark lines that spread like veins, like the fingers of some enormous hand reaching down toward them. Then the pressure released. The ceiling snapped back to its normal position. The cracks remained, visible in the lamplight, a web of damage that would never fully heal. But the presence, if that is what it had been, retreated. The footsteps resumed above them, moving away from the center of the cabin, returning to their endless pattern. Back and forth, as if nothing had happened. As if the attempted intrusion had been merely an experiment, a test of the boundaries between worlds, between the living and whatever else occupied that space above the ceiling. William Pruitt did not sleep again during their time in that cabin. He sat by the door with his rifle, watching the ceiling, waiting for the wood to begin bending again. Catherine and the children huddled together, dozing fitfully, waking at every sound. The storm continued for 3 more days, and during those 72 hours, the family existed in a state of suspended terror, aware that they were trapped with something that had no name, no face, no form they could recognize or fight. They rationed their food, kept the fire burning, and endured. It was all they could do. When the storm finally broke on December 12th, William began loading the wagons before the snow had stopped falling. He worked with frantic energy, throwing their possessions into the wagon beds with no regard for organization or care, driven by the single-minded need to be away from that place, to put distance between his family and the cabin where footsteps walked across the ceiling every night. Catherine helped him, her movements mechanical and slow, while the children stood outside in the snow and watched with empty eyes. They looked like ghosts themselves, pale and silent and diminished, as if the cabin had already begun to consume them. They left at noon, the wagon struggling through snow that reached the hubs of the wheels. William did not look back. Catherine did once, and she later told a minister's wife in Lander that she saw something in the window of the loft, a shadow that might have been a face or might have been nothing at all, but it watched them leave, and she felt its attention like a cold hand on the back of her neck. The children never spoke of their time in the cabin. When asked about it in later years, they would change the subject or claim not to remember. But Mary Pruitt developed a habit of sleeping with her face turned toward the wall, never looking up, always keeping her gaze fixed downward or straight ahead, as if she feared that looking at a ceiling, any ceiling, might invite something to look back. The Pruitt family reached Lander in the early evening of December 13th. They stayed in the settlement for 3 weeks, recovering their strength, before continuing on to Montana, where William had a brother who owned a cattle ranch. They never returned to the cabin. They never spoke of it publicly. But William kept a journal, and in the pages of that journal, he recorded every detail of their experience, writing in a cramped, urgent hand that suggested he needed to document what had happened before he lost his nerve, before he convinced himself that it had been exhaustion, or fear, or imagination. The journal was discovered in 1943 in a trunk in an attic in Billings, Montana, among the possessions of William's granddaughter. It had been sealed with wax and wrapped in cloth, and attached to it was a note in William's handwriting that read simply, "Do not go back. Do not let anyone go back." The cabin stood empty again through the winter of 1880. Spring came, then summer, and the grass grew tall in the clearing while the structure slowly weathered and aged. Dutch Henry, the supply trader who had encountered Samuel Goode, heard rumors about the Pruitt family's strange departure and their refusal to explain why they had abandoned a perfectly good cabin in the middle of winter. Being a curious and practical man, and seeing an opportunity to claim a valuable piece of property, Dutch Henry decided to investigate for himself. He arrived at the cabin on a warm afternoon in July of 1880. The door hung open, and the interior smelled of mice and mildew. He spent several hours exploring the space, impressed by the solid construction, already calculating how much work it would take to make the cabin livable again. He found the Pruitts' belongings scattered about, items they had apparently deemed not worth the effort of carrying in their hasty departure. A broken mirror, a dented pot, a child's wooden doll with a missing arm. Dutch Henry gathered what seemed useful and set it aside, then climbed into the loft to assess the storage space. The loft was dry and spacious, perfect for keeping supplies safe from moisture and animals. The floorboards were solid, though he noticed an unusual pattern of cracks in the ceiling above, radiating out from the center like the impact point of a stone thrown into water. He traced the cracks with his fingers, wondering what could have caused such damage. Expansion and contraction from temperature changes, most likely. Nothing to worry about. The structure was sound. Dutch Henry decided he would claim the cabin as his own. He spent that first night sleeping on the floor near the fireplace, wrapped in his bedroll, planning the repairs and improvements he would make. He fell asleep easily, exhausted from the long ride, and slept deeply until something woke him in the hours before dawn. A sound, rhythmic and steady. Footsteps, walking across the ceiling directly above his head, back and forth, measured and deliberate, as if someone were pacing in the loft where he had been standing just hours before, where he knew for certain there was no one, nothing, just empty space and storage and the cracks in the ceiling that spread like frozen lightning. Dutch Henry sat up slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. He listened. The footsteps continued, unhurried, patient, eternal. He reached for the lantern beside him, his hand shaking so badly it took him 3 attempts to strike a match. The light flared, pushing back the darkness, and in its glow he could see the ceiling above him, the rough pine boards that marked the floor of the loft. As he watched, dust began to sift down between the cracks, disturbed by the footsteps that should not exist, could not exist, but did exist regardless of what logic or reason insisted was possible. Dutch Henry left the cabin while it was still dark, not bothering to gather his belongings, abandoning his bedroll and supplies in his desperate need to be away from that place. He stumbled through the forest in the pre-dawn darkness, branches whipping his face, roots catching his feet, driven by a panic he had never experienced before in all his years on the frontier. He had faced hostile Indians, had survived blizzards and floods and the countless dangers that came with life in the territories, but nothing had prepared him for the particular terror of those footsteps, for the fundamental wrongness of something walking where nothing should be able to walk, for the violation of natural law that the cabin represented. He reached his horse and mounted in a single frantic motion, kicking the animal into a gallop before he was fully in the saddle, riding through the darkness with no thought for the terrain or the dangers of traveling at speed through unfamiliar forest. The horse seemed to share his urgency, racing through the trees as if it too could sense something wrong with the place they were leaving behind, as if the very air around the cabin carried a taint that animals could detect more readily than men. They did not stop until they reached the trading post at first light, both man and horse covered in sweat despite the cold, both trembling with exhaustion, and something deeper than exhaustion, something that came from the soul rather than the body. Dutch Henry immediately began spreading the word that the cabin was cursed, that it was haunted, that anyone who valued their sanity and their life should stay away from that place. He told his story to anyone who would listen, describing the footsteps in detail, the rhythm and weight of them, the impossibility of them, the way they had made him feel as if the solid ground beneath his feet had become uncertain, as if reality itself had developed cracks through which something terrible was seeping. Some believed him. Dutch Henry was known as a reliable man, not given to flights of fancy or exaggeration, and his obvious distress lent credibility to his account. Others did not believe, or chose not to believe, because accepting his story meant accepting a universe more dangerous and mysterious than they were prepared to acknowledge. But over the following months and years, the stories accumulated, each one adding another layer to the legend of the cabin where footsteps walked across the ceiling every night. A prospector named Tom Wardell spent a single night there in the spring of 1881, drawn by curiosity and the challenge of debunking what he considered superstitious nonsense. He was found the next morning wandering the forest 2 miles from the cabin, his clothes torn and his feet bloody from walking without boots, incoherent and babbling about footsteps that walked upside down, about gravity that worked backward, about a ceiling that was somehow also a floor, and a floor that was somehow also a ceiling. He could not explain what he meant by these statements, could not put into words the experience that had shattered his understanding of the physical world. He died 3 days later from exposure and terror, his body simply giving up, his heart stopping not from any physical ailment, but from the overwhelming strain of having experienced something his mind could not process or accept. A pair of trappers, brothers named Elias and John Brennan, heard about the cabin from Dutch Henry and decided to investigate for themselves in the winter of 1882. They were skeptical men, practical and hard-headed, and they were convinced that whatever people were hearing had a natural explanation that fear and superstition had blown out of proportion. They set up camp in the cabin, built a fire in the fireplace, cooked their dinner, and settled in to prove that there was nothing supernatural about the place. The footsteps began at midnight, exactly as they always did, and the Brennan brothers listened with growing unease as the sounds crossed the ceiling above them. Back and forth, steady and measured and impossible to dismiss as wind or animals, or the settling of old wood. They climbed into the loft with lanterns and weapons, searching every corner, finding nothing. They came back down and the footsteps continued above them, now directly overhead, now walking the space they had just searched and found empty. Elias, the older brother, began to laugh, a sound that started as genuine amusement at the absurdity of the situation, but quickly took on a hysterical edge, a note of panic that he could not control. John tried to calm him, but the laughter only grew louder, more frantic, until it was indistinguishable from sobbing. They fled the cabin at 2 a.m, leaving behind their traps and supplies, everything they had brought with them, their only thought to escape the sound of those footsteps, to put distance between themselves and the place where the fundamental rules of existence had been suspended. They rode through the night and did not stop until they reached Lander, where they immediately sold their horses and equipment and bought tickets on the first stage heading east. They never trapped again. They never spoke of what they had heard except to warn others, and even then they could not fully articulate the horror of it, the way it had made them feel as if they were slipping out of the world they knew into some other world where different laws applied, where the dead could walk and the living were not welcome. A missionary who attempted to perform an exorcism in the cabin and emerged 6 hours later, white-haired and mute, never speaking another word until his death 2 years later in an asylum in Denver. The cabin acquired a reputation. The locals began to avoid the area entirely, giving the clearing a wide berth when they traveled through that part of the territory. Occasionally, someone would venture close enough to see the structure from a distance, its walls weathered to gray, its windows dark and empty, its chimney cold. But no one stayed. No one lived there. The cabin became a marker, a landmark whose name was known but never spoken aloud, as if giving voice to it might somehow invoke its attention. In the summer of 1883, a surveying team from the territorial government passed through the area while mapping the region for future development. One of the surveyors, a young man named Robert Kinsey, who had come west from Massachusetts and did not believe in ghost stories, insisted on examining the cabin despite warnings from his colleagues. He wanted to document the structure, to include it in their maps and reports. He entered the cabin at noon and was never seen again. The surveying team searched for him for 3 days, calling his name, following every possible trail, but found no trace. His compass, however, was discovered on the floor of the loft, its needle spinning wildly, unable to find north, turning in endless circles as if the fundamental laws of magnetism had ceased to function within those walls. The territorial government quietly removed the cabin from all official maps. It became, in the bureaucratic sense, a place that did not exist. No records were kept of the deaths associated with it. No investigations were conducted. The land itself was never claimed, never sold, never developed. It remained a blank space, a void in the otherwise steady march of civilization across Wyoming territory, an absence that was more potent than any presence could have been. The Shoshone, in their oral histories, spoke of Nemihupia as a place where the boundaries between the world of the living and the world of the dead had worn thin, where something had happened long before the white men arrived that had torn a hole in the fabric of reality itself. They said it was a place where a great massacre had occurred, though whether of their people or another tribe they did not say. They said the earth there had drunk so much blood that it had become sick, that it had begun to remember violence the way a body remembers pain, that it had developed a kind of consciousness that manifested in the reversal of natural order. They said that those who died on that ground did not walk forward into death but backward, upside down, their footsteps echoing in the space above rather than below, their passage a mockery of life, a curse that would persist until the land itself healed or the world ended, whichever came first. Whether this explanation was true or not, the footsteps continued. Hunters camping too close to the clearing reported hearing them in the distance, that steady rhythm carrying through the night air like a heartbeat, like a clock, like the measure of something infinite and patient. The sounds became a fixture of the local folklore, a warning parents gave to children, a story told in whispers around campfires, the cabin where footsteps walked across the ceiling every night, the place where men went mad, the clearing that even animals avoided, where the grass grew sparse and stunted, where the trees leaned away as if pushed by a wind that never stopped blowing. By the turn of the century, the cabin had collapsed. The roof caved in during a heavy snow, the walls fell outward, the fireplace crumbled to a pile of stones overgrown with moss and lichen. Nature reclaimed the clearing slowly, but never completely. The space remained visible, an open wound in the forest, a place where the undergrowth would not quite close, where the trees would not quite grow. And on certain nights, usually in winter, usually when the moon was dark and the temperature had dropped well below freezing, people traveling through that region claimed they could still hear them. The footsteps, walking in the air above the ruins, walking in the space where the ceiling used to be, walking back and forth, with a patience that suggested eternity, with a rhythm that suggested purpose, with a persistence that suggested hunger. In 1927, a historian from the University of Wyoming attempted to research the history of the cabin for a book he was writing about frontier settlements. He spent weeks in archives, reading old newspapers and journals, interviewing elderly residents of Lander who might remember stories their grandparents had told them. He compiled a file of accounts, testimonies, and reports that numbered over 200 pages. Then he traveled to the site itself, determined to find archaeological evidence that might support or refute the supernatural claims. He found the ruins of the cabin easily enough, though the forest had grown thick around it and he had to cut his way through with a machete. He set up camp 100 yards away, planning to spend a week excavating and documenting the site. On his first night there, he woke to the sound of footsteps, not in his tent, not in the forest around him, but in the air above the ruins of the cabin, invisible but distinct, that same measured pattern that had been described in every account he had read. He listened to the sounds for 3 hours, his sleeping bag pulled up to his chin, his body rigid with fear and fascination. When dawn came, he packed his equipment and left. The 200 pages of research were found after his death, in a filing cabinet in his office at the university, with a notepaper clipped to the front that read, "Some questions should not be answered. Some places should not be remembered. Let this one fade." But places like the cabin do not fade. They persist in the collective memory, in the warnings passed down through generations, in the instinctive avoidance that people feel when they approach certain grounds without knowing why. The land where the cabin stood has been offered for sale multiple times over the past century. No one has ever purchased it. Developers have surveyed it, considered it, then moved on to other properties without explanation. The clearing remains, visible from satellite images, a pale scar in the otherwise unbroken green of the national forest that now surrounds it. Modern visitors to the area, hikers and backpackers who wander off the marked trails, occasionally stumble across the ruins. Most take a few photographs and move on. Some feel an immediate, overwhelming urge to leave, a primal fear that has no rational basis but is no less powerful for its irrationality. A few have reported hearing sounds that they cannot explain, that rhythmic walking that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, that makes them question their own senses and their understanding of what is possible in the natural world. In 2012, a group of paranormal investigators obtained permits to spend 3 nights at the site, bringing with them recording equipment, electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and all the technological apparatus of modern ghost hunting. They documented hours of audio and video. Most of it showed nothing unusual. But on the second night, at approximately midnight according to the timestamp, their audio recorders captured a sound, clear and distinct. Footsteps, walking in a steady rhythm above where the cabin ceiling would have been. Back and forth, back and forth. The investigators listened to the recording dozens of times, trying to find a natural explanation. They analyzed the waveforms, filtered the audio, consulted with acoustic experts. They found nothing that could account for the sounds except what their equipment had recorded: footsteps walking in empty air, in a space where nothing existed but memory and darkness. The investigators presented their findings at a conference on paranormal phenomena in Las Vegas. The recording was played for an audience of skeptics and believers, scientists and spiritualists, people who had devoted their lives to proving or disproving the existence of the supernatural. When the footsteps began to play through the auditorium speakers, several people left the room. Others sat in uncomfortable silence. One woman in the third row began to cry, though she could not explain why. The recording ended, and the lead investigator stepped to the podium to discuss his team's conclusions. Before he could speak, the power in the auditorium failed. Complete darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in after 30 seconds, but in that half-minute of absolute blackness, several attendees later reported hearing the footsteps again, this time in the auditorium itself, walking across the ceiling far above their heads, invisible and impossible, and real. The investigators' team dissolved 6 months after the conference. 2 of the members quit the field of paranormal research entirely. The lead investigator moved to Florida and refused all interview requests. The recording itself was uploaded to the internet, where it was downloaded thousands of times before being removed at the request of the investigators. Copies still circulate on obscure websites dedicated to supernatural phenomena, but those who listen to it often report feeling a deep unease, a sense that they have heard something they were not meant to hear, that they have been exposed to knowledge that carries a price. The Shoshone elders, when asked about the site in recent years, simply shake their heads. They will not discuss it in detail. They will not travel near it. They say only that some places are not meant for human beings, that there are grounds where the dead do not rest because they cannot rest, where trauma has become so deeply embedded in the soil and stone and air that it has achieved a kind of permanence, a continuous present tense that plays out over and over regardless of who is there to witness it. They say that the footsteps will continue until the earth itself forgets what happened there. And the earth, they say, has a very long memory. In the winter of 2019, a young woman named Sarah Chen drove from Denver to Wyoming as part of a solo road trip through the Mountain West. She was interested in abandoned places, in the aesthetics of decay, in the romance of ruins. She had read about the cabin online, had seen the photographs and heard the stories, and had decided to visit the site herself. She parked at the nearest Forest Service road and hiked through the snow to the clearing, her camera around her neck, her backpack full of water and snacks and extra batteries. She found the ruins in the late afternoon light, the foundation stones barely visible beneath a blanket of fresh snow, the forest pressing close on all sides. She took photographs for an hour, circling the site, framing shots of the collapsed chimney and the scattered remains of logs that had once been walls. She felt nothing unusual, no sense of dread or unease. The place was just an old ruin in a pretty clearing, sad and forgotten but not frightening. She decided to camp nearby for the night, to catch the sight in the dawn light when the shadows would be long and the atmosphere more dramatic. Sarah Chen pitched her tent at the edge of the clearing and cooked a simple meal over her portable stove. She watched the sun set through the trees, turning the snow orange and pink, then deep blue as darkness fell. She crawled into her sleeping bag and read by headlamp for a while, before turning off the light and settling into sleep. The night was quiet, except for the wind in the trees and the occasional crack of a branch breaking under the weight of snow. She drifted off easily, tired from the hike and the cold. She woke at midnight to the sound of footsteps. Her first thought was that another hiker had arrived and was walking around the campsite. She unzipped her tent and looked out, expecting to see a headlamp or hear a voice. The clearing was empty. The snow was undisturbed except for her own tracks from earlier. But the footsteps continued. She looked up, following the sound, and realized with a cold shock that they were coming from above her, from the air over the ruins of the cabin, from the space where the ceiling would have been if the structure still stood. Back and forth, steady and measured. The sound was clear and distinct, audible above the wind, above her own hammering heartbeat. She stared at the empty air, at the darkness above the ruins, and she understood in that moment that all the stories had been true, that the place really was haunted or cursed or afflicted with some presence that defied explanation. She wanted to run, to grab her pack and flee into the forest, but she was paralyzed by a fear so profound it had locked her muscles, had frozen her in place, had made her a witness to something she had never wanted to see. The footsteps continued for 3 hours. Sarah Chen sat in her tent with her knees pulled to her chest, her camera forgotten, her aesthetic appreciation of decay replaced by raw, animal terror. She did not sleep. She did not move. She simply endured, listening to the rhythm that never varied, that never stopped, that seemed to mark time in a dimension she could not access, but that accessed her regardless, that reached into her tent and into her mind, and planted there a seed of understanding that would grow into nightmares for years to come. When dawn arrived, the footsteps stopped. Sarah Chen broke camp in 15 minutes, leaving behind her stove and one of her tent poles in her haste to be away from that place. She hiked back to her car and drove directly to Denver without stopping except for gas. She did not post the photographs she had taken on social media. She did not write about her experience on any blog or forum. She told no one what she had heard until 5 years later, when she mentioned it to a therapist during a session about anxiety and insomnia. The therapist suggested it had been auditory hallucination brought on by the power of suggestion and the isolation of solo camping. Sarah Chen nodded and agreed, but she knew what she had heard, and she knew it had been real, and she knew she would never go back to Wyoming, would never camp alone, would never again dismiss the stories that people told about places where something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. The cabin is gone now, reduced to a few stones and rotting wood scattered across a clearing in the Wyoming wilderness. The people who lived there, who died there, who fled from there, are all dead themselves now. Their stories preserved only in letters and journals and oral histories that fewer and fewer people remember or care about. The world has moved on. The frontier is closed. Wyoming territory became a state. The West was won, or so the narrative goes. But the clearing remains. And on certain nights when conditions are right and the barriers between possible and impossible grow thin, the footsteps still walk, back and forth, above the ruins, above the ground, in the space between earth and sky where something learned to move, where something learned to persist, where something continues to mark its territory and measure its domain in a rhythm that will outlast every human memory, every record, every attempt to explain or contain or forget. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. Some places were never meant to be claimed. And some sounds, once heard, can never be unheard, will echo in the minds of those who heard them until the day they die. A reminder that the world contains mysteries that technology cannot measure and reason cannot explain. That there are still dark corners where the dead walk upside down and the living should not follow. The cabin is gone, but what inhabited it remains, patient, eternal, walking across a ceiling that no longer exists except in the space between memory and nightmare, between history and horror, between what we know and what we fear. Back and forth, forever and always, until the stars go cold and the mountains crumble to dust, and there is no one left to hear the sound of footsteps walking where no footsteps should ever walk.